Developing tonight, the terror army known as ISIS may be getting some help from some bad guys we've seen before. Administration sources telling Fox News that a couple dozen former Gitmo prisoners just released in the last couple of years are back on the battlefield helping ISIS. National security correspondent Jennifer Griffin has more.
Megan, U.S. intelligence sources tell us as many as 20 to 30 former Guantanamo Bay detainees have joined forces with ISIS and other militant groups inside Syria, cementing fears that the U.S. military is once again encountering militants taken off the battlefield and released from Gitmo.
We know that some of the detainees that have come out of Guantanamo have gone back to the fight, to the battlefield. We're aware of that.
One example, in April of this year, Ibrahim bin Shakaran, a Moroccan who had spent more than 3 years at Gitmo, was reported killed while leading a known jihadist group in Syria fighting President Bashar Assad's forces. The chairman of the Armed Services Committee called for an immediate suspension of detainee releases in a letter to the defense secretary today. Quote, "The U.S. government must not release terrorist detainees at the same time we have committed U.S. service members to fight ISIL. To continue to do so just as we have had to open a new front in the war on terror is unthinkable." There are now 149 prisoners held at Guantanamo Bay. 80 are currently cleared for release. Former U.S. ambassador to Iraq from 2010 to 2012, James Jeffrey, says he would not recommend releasing more Gitmo detainees.
These people are very ideologically and essentially religiously committed to their evil cause, and it is very hard to sort out who are going to stay at home and who are going to return to the battlefield.
In fact, one of the leading jihadist groups in Syria right now was formed by 3 Moroccans who were released from Guantanamo Bay. Megan.
Jennifer Griffin, thank you. Joining me now with more, Mark Thiessen, who's a former presidential speechwriter, Washington Post columnist, and an American Enterprise Institute fellow, and Pete Hegseth, who's a Fox News contributor, CEO of Concerned Veterans for America, and an Afghanistan and Iraq war veteran who once served as a guard at Guantanamo Bay. Pete, given that, let me start with you on your reaction.
What this administration is doing right now is effectively sending reinforcements to ISIS and al-Qaeda. This is a catch-and-release program out of Guantanamo Bay. When I was in Guantanamo Bay in 2004 and 2005, there were about 600. There's only 150 there right now. And President Bush released a lot more detainees than President Obama has, but he was releasing those that had been swept up on the battlefield. You saw a lower recidivism rate then, closer to 10%. We're now seeing closer to 30% of detainees that leave Guantanamo Bay going to the battlefield. And what's important about what Jennifer said is those 20 or 30 are not just in their home countries. They've gone to Syria. They're joined up with ISIS, and now they've got the badge of courage from being from Guantanamo Bay. They're jihadist all-stars, and Megan, they're very well networked. I reviewed all the countries these guys are from again today. It reads every country in the Middle East. They've been radicalized for a decade. They know each other. They'll use that network, and releasing them right now makes our job of defeating ISIS that much more difficult.
You know, what was the alternative, Mark? You know, because President Bush established Gitmo. It was controversial from the start. He also let a bunch of these guys out, and now our current president has let a bunch of these guys out, and they're doing what is very predictable, returning to the battlefield.
No, that's exactly right. And look, I think in fairness to President Obama, President Bush let a lot of Guantanamo detainees out, some that were considered to be lower risk, but turned out to be very high risk. I mean, we have Guantanamo detainees, former alumni of Guantanamo Bay, who are in leadership positions in al-Qaeda in Yemen, in the Taliban regime in Afghanistan, and the Taliban fighters leading the fight against Americans there and in Libya as well. So, you know, what we've seen is that these people, especially these senior leaders, go back to the fight. And so, but the question really is, why are they flocking to Syria? Why are these Guantanamo detainees flocking to Syria? Why, for that matter, are thousands of jihadists from all over the world flocking to Syria? Because ISIS is winning, and we are losing. What this administration doesn't seem to understand is that the biggest terrorist recruitment tool is not the existence of Guantanamo Bay. It's the perception of American weakness. When ISIS can withstand U.S. Air Force strikes and continue advancing in Iraq, that is a perception of weakness. That sends a signal to the jihadists of the world that we're standing up to the great Satan, we're standing up to America, and we can defeat them, and they come flocking to fight.
And Pete, when they go back after having served time at Gitmo, does it enlarge their persona in some way?
Of course it does. I mean, there's there's a myth around Guantanamo Bay and what they've survived and how they've dealt with it. They are immediately shoot up the ranks. They've got that credibility. But you asked the question, Megan, about what do you do about it? What do you do about it? You try them in commissions, you find those guilty that are guilty, and you execute them. That's what you do to an enemy that's trying to kill you. That's the most humane thing to do, because you know what the least humane thing to do is to release them, allow them to go to Syria and Iraq and kill civilians, behead journalists, and create even more instability that leads to deaths.
They say that the guys who are being released are not the worst of the worst. You know, that we don't release Zacharias Moussaoui. We release these other guys who are like a driver for a bad guy.
Megan, we do.
Hold on, Pete, and then Mark.
We released 5 for a purported deserter, 5 of the worst of the worst. So I wouldn't put it past this administration in a goal to close Guantanamo Bay to wholesale clear them all out. I really wouldn't.
Yeah, you know, when in the Bush administration, we released a guy named Mullah Zakir, who said he was a low fighter. He just wanted to go home to his family. He was assessed as being medium risk. He actually turned out to be the Taliban's top commander, leading the fight against Obama's surge in 2009, was personally responsible for massacres and for the killing of American and coalition forces. So sometimes a guy who seems to be low level in Guantanamo turns out to be very high level when he gets back to the battlefield.
And now the president is still determined to release or transfer the rest of these detainees because he wants Gitmo closed. Pete, those who feels the president does believe that it is inhumane to hold them there, that many are not being held on very serious charges, and that we can't just hold them forever in a facility that's been the subject of so much criticism.
Why not? Why can't we hold them forever? Having been there, and when folks go there, they see a world-class, humane facility where these guys get access to. You know what they're doing? Many of these guys that are the most radical, they're praying 5 times a day because we give them every observance. They're praying for the very caliphate that they're now going back to fight for. We bend over backwards to care for them in this facility. We should stand up for who we are and what we're fighting for, as opposed to just cowing. I agree with Mitt Romney when he's running in 2012. We should double Guantanamo Bay, use it as a facility where people who try to kill our people are held and then eventually tried and moved on if there's somewhere else to put them. Problem is, the folks we traded that are supposed to be in Qatar for Bo Bergdahl, they'll likely find their way back to Afghanistan too. These home countries don't do a very good job of holding on to them.
Quick last question for you, Mark. Does this change in any way the push to close Gitmo, do you think?
Oh, I think it makes it very hard for him to close Guantanamo. I mean, just what's happening in Syria makes it very hard for him to close Guantanamo Bay. I mean, keep in mind that when when Congress restricted President Obama's powers to close Guantanamo Bay, it was the Democratic Senate, and it was a vote of 90-6. So if the Democrats lose the Senate on Tuesday, I don't think they're going to see closing Guantanamo as the issue that brings them back to the majority. I think this is. There's not a lot of bipartisan consensus in Washington, but keeping Guantanamo open seems to be one of the few issues.
Interesting point.
Yeah.
Guys,